200 orc warriors don't just emerge from the shadows of Grimwood by accident. They come for blood, for justice, or for war. And Thaddeus Mallister was about to find out which one it was. But let's go back to where it all started. Lost between Grimwood and nowhere, Thaddeus Mallister spotted a small figure stumbling along the creek bank. An orc child, bright green skin covered in rags of torn tribal garments, yellow eyes clouded with hunger, every step a battle against her own body. There are three kinds of courage in the world. The first belongs to the man who charges an army because he has nothing left to lose. The second belongs to the man who pretends not to see the suffering of others because he has everything to lose. The third, the rarest, the most silent, the most costly, belongs to the man who sees clearly what he stands to lose and extends his hand anyway. Grimwood taught its settlers to practice the second. Thaddeus Mallister, for reasons he himself couldn't fully explain, had been born incapable of it. He was 34 years old and lived at the edges of the known world, not by adventure, by exhaustion. After the Black Fever took Maren and little Edric 3 years before, the center of civilization had ceased to make sense. Grimwood was enough. The work was enough. The fence needed mending. The roof leaked in winter. The garden produced exactly what was necessary. It was a life built of small tasks, each one a brick laid over the absence so it wouldn't swallow everything. It was early morning, the air still carrying the smell of wet earth from the rain that had fallen in the night, when the movement at the creek bank caught his attention. The light cut through the oaks at low angles, golden and cold at once, turning the steam rising from the water into something almost sacred. He was mending a fence post with dirt-covered hands and a hammer resting on his shoulder when he saw her. The girl was no more than 8 or 9 years old. She walked in zigzags, as though the ground moved beneath her feet in waves only she could feel. The bright green skin contrasted violently with the rags of tribal garments that hung from her like survivors of a battle her small body hadn't won. Long ears, slightly pointed, flattened against her skull in an involuntary gesture of fear or pain. When she stumbled for the third time, this time her knees touching the mud of the bank, he had already set down the hammer. Her yellow eyes, too large for the thin face bright as dirty amber, met Thaddeus's with a mixture of fear and desperation that hit him like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't the look of an animal. It was the look of someone who had already calculated the odds and found them terrible, but who looked anyway because there was no longer energy to look away. Most settlers in Grimwood would have reached for the musket before asking any questions. The relationship between humans and the orc clans of the forest had been tense for years. Raids, reprisals, blood from both sides soaking the red earth that lay between the houses and the trees. Children grew up learning that yellow eyes in the forest meant danger. It didn't matter the size of the body that carried them, but Thaddeus thought of Edric, of how his son had looked at him on the last feverish night with those same eyes, too large, bright in a way that wasn't health, with that same mixture of fear and trust that shouldn't coexist but did, because when you are a child, fear and trust in an adult's hands are often the same thing. He walked slowly toward the girl with his hands plainly visible, palms open, the universal gesture of "I am not a threat" that transcends any language. She stepped back instinctively, but her legs didn't quite obey, and she nearly fell again. Thaddeus knelt in the mud without a second thought. He came down to her eye level. He waited. She looked at him for a long moment, evaluating with an intelligence that hunger hadn't managed to fully extinguish. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry 3 days of weight, she let him carry her in his arms. She didn't resist. She was too weak for that. And perhaps, part of her knew there was no longer energy to resist the only hands that had come close without holding a weapon. Thaddeus carried her to the cabin with the same care he had learned to carry fragile things, and something that had been still inside him for 3 years moved gently, like ice beginning to yield on the first morning of spring. Inside the cabin, the stew of roots and rabbit still bubbled over the embers with a thick smell that had seeped into the old wooden planks, the cloak hanging on the wall. The very air. It was the smell of home, not necessarily a happy home, but a functional one, a place where someone still took the trouble to cook, which was a way of saying tomorrow exists. Thaddeus set the girl in the only chair and went straight to the fire. He filled a large ladle, added a piece of bread he had baked that morning, still soft in the crumb, the crust breaking with a dry crack, and placed everything on the table before her with care not to make sudden movements. Like taming a wounded animal, except she wasn't an animal. She was a child, and that made everything at once simpler and infinitely heavier. The smell of the food did something to her eyes. The murky amber blinked, and for a moment, just one, hunger ceased to be the only thing visible on that face and made room for something that might have been hope for the first time in days. She looked at the bowl, looked at him, back at the bowl. A hesitation that lasted less than 3 seconds, but that Thaddeus felt like a window opening onto something he couldn't quite name. He turned his back and went to fetch water, deliberately, so she could eat without feeling watched. He heard the sound of the wooden spoon against the ceramic, and something in his chest relaxed a muscle it didn't know was clenched. It was when he returned with the pitcher that he saw it. Partially hidden beneath the torn rags, visible because she had bent over the bowl and the fabric had slipped from her shoulder, was a ritual bead necklace. Black and grey stones alternating in a precise pattern interspersed with polished animal teeth. At the centre, a carved bone pendant engraved with symbols Thaddeus had seen described in exact detail the previous week, when the neighbour Pellman had returned pale from a trip to town and spent the afternoon recounting the territorial markings that Orc scouts had left on the pines along the main road. The sacred markings of the Grey Tusk clan, the clan of High Chief Toro Cruel, the most feared and respected Orc in all the Grimwood lands, the man about whom war ballads had been written that human children sang as lullabies to frighten each other. The chief who had defended the secret canyons for 15 years against 4 human expulsion attempts and 2 clan wars. The father who, according to rumors that drifted from the forest now and then, like leaves carried on the wind, loved his only daughter with a ferocity that made his war reputation seem moderate. Thaddeus stood motionless for a moment with the pitcher in his hand. The stew kept bubbling. The girl kept eating, faster now, as if her body had confirmed that the food was real and given permission for urgency. A crumb of bread fell on the table, and she gathered it carefully without waste, with the gesture of someone who had learned that food is not discarded. If this girl was who he thought she was, he wasn't simply helping a starving child. He was sheltering the daughter of the man capable of bringing 200 warriors to his door without blinking, for the simple reason that 200 warriors existed to be brought when he so determined. Thaddeus set the pitcher on the table slowly. He sat on the bench opposite. The girl raised her eyes, that intense amber, now less clouded, the hunger receding enough for the child to become visible again behind it, and looked at him with an expression that wasn't exactly trust, but might have been its precursor. It was too late to turn back. Not because circumstances prevented him, but because he looked at her and saw the trembling hand still holding the bowl as if it were the most precious thing in the world, and he knew, with the certainty of convictions that need no argument, that he couldn't bring himself to turn her out. Not through this door, not from this cabin, not from this life that had learned at great cost that small things, a fire, a meal, a hand extended without conditions, were often the only ones that mattered. He filled the pitcher into a cup and pushed it toward her. She emptied it in 3 swallows. Less than an hour later, exhaustion finally conquered her small body. The amber eyes closed in the chair, the empty bowl still in her lap, and her breathing softened into the rhythm Thaddeus recognized as the deep sleep of someone who had finally felt safe enough to lose consciousness. He lifted the bowl from her lap with surgical care, covered her with the only cloak he had, and stood still for a moment looking at her. Toro cruel, he thought. May the forest spirits help me. It was then that he heard the hoofbeats on the dirt trail. 3 riders arrived unannounced, as trouble tends to do. Thaddeus stepped out to the yard before they could knock. He didn't want the noise to wake the girl, and recognized all 3 before they had fully dismounted. Cletus, the neighboring farm's owner, a man as wide as a barn door with a corresponding sense of subtlety. Morrison, Lord Aldrich's feudal inspector, whose official job was collecting taxes and whose real job was ensuring that nothing disturbed the order that made the taxes possible. And Reverend Thorn, whose presence in any difficult situation served simultaneously as a suggestion to pray and a warning that things could get worse. The smell of sweaty horse and leather mixed with the morning air. Cletus wasted no time. Grey Tusk clan scouts on the trails, Mallister. 5 groups, tracking something since before dawn. He paused with the calculated weight of a man delivering bad news he had rehearsed on the way over. They say Toro Cruel lost his daughter 3 days ago, that any human found with her answers for it personally, Morrison added, in the flat voice of someone who deals in facts. Feudal law doesn't protect you here. If the orcs want blood inside the forest borders, Lord Aldrich doesn't send armies. You know that. Reverend Thorn looked at the cabin with the narrowed eyes of a man who had learned to read the silence of places. Is there someone inside, Thaddeus? His given name, in Thorn's mouth, always sounded like a sentence being read aloud. Thaddeus didn't answer directly. He crossed his arms and stood in the yard, with the posture of someone who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the others to reach the same conclusion. "What options are you offering me?" he asked. 2, said Cletus. You return the child now before the scouts arrive, and maybe you come out of this with the farm intact. Or you take your horse and come with me to town before dark and let the problem sort itself out. The 3rd option is doing nothing, said Morrison, and waking tomorrow, if you wake at all. Thaddeus looked at the 3 of them. They were practical men, not bad men necessarily. They were men who had learned to survive in Grimwood by the same rule everyone else had learned. Don't get involved in what isn't yours, because what isn't yours generally has teeth. It was a functional philosophy. It was a philosophy that had kept Grimwood relatively intact for 2 generations. It was also, he thought, the philosophy that guaranteed nothing would ever change. She came to me on her own, he said, hungry, alone. I did what any person would do. No person would, said Cletus, and there was something in the frankness of the statement that was almost admirable. Then I did what should be done. Thaddeus didn't raise his voice. He never did. She's sleeping inside. She's fine. When she wakes, if she wants to leave, she'll go. If her father arrives first, I'll explain what happened. You'll explain, Morrison repeated in a tone that turned the word into an epitaph. Reverend Thorn dismounted slowly and approached Thaddeus close enough to speak quietly. There is valor, he said, and there is stubbornness that disguises itself as valor, son. I know you lost your family. I know that since then you've been searching for something worth the risk. But this girl has a family, and that family is coming to find her with 400 armed hands. He paused. You won't get yourself killed for her. I'm not getting killed for her, said Thaddeus. I'm staying with her until someone comes to collect her. If her father wants a conversation, he'll have one. Thorn stood still for a moment, looking at him with that specific expression religious men wear before something that is neither clearly sin nor clearly virtue, but that unsettles them all the same. Then he returned to his horse. The three rode off, shaking their heads at slightly different angles, like men who had tried to warn and considered their responsibility fulfilled. Thaddeus went back inside. The girl was still sleeping, her breath slow and steady, the amber eyes closed beneath dark lashes. He sat on the bench by the fire, added another log, and listened to the crackling of the wood, with the attention of someone who is present for lack of a better alternative. The dark came slowly, as it always does in Grimwood, not all at once, but in layers. The dusk thickening between the oaks until the shadows became the main environment and the firelight became the only reference point. Thaddeus was looking at the painted parchment miniature on the table, Maren smiling, Edric in her lap, the dried flowers he replaced every week because he had promised, and promises were the only currency that still held value. When the first drum sounded. Slow, methodical, still distant but unmistakable. Each beat one step closer, each interval a measure of time counting down towards something that had no name yet, but already had weight. The girl woke with a start, eyes wide, and looked at Thaddeus with an urgency that needed no translation. She began counting on her fingers, showing him with the expression of someone transmitting vital information that could be conveyed no other way. 10, 20, 50. She didn't stop until she reached 200. Thaddeus looked at his own fingers for a moment. 200, he thought. Then he stood, walked to the door, and opened it wide. If 200 warriors were coming, he would receive them standing in the yard, with his hands visible. It was the only thing he knew how to do that still made any sense. They emerged from the shadows of Grimwood, as if the forest itself had sewn them together. There was no war cry, no charge. There was something more efficient and more terrifying than any charge. There was order. 200 orc warriors in perfect formation, moving with the coherence of a single organism that had rehearsed this movement in dreams for generations. Bright green skin marked with war paint in lines and spirals that Thaddeus couldn't read, but whose purpose was universal. Polished tusks gleaming in the moonlight, bows drawn with a precision that wasn't threat. It was natural state, like breathing. Bone axes raised at angles that calculated distances. They encircled the barn and the cabin in a semicircle so precise it might have been drawn by an architect. Each warrior at exactly the same distance from the next. Each bow pointed at the same central point in the yard where Thaddeus stood, with his hands raised and open, palms forward, feeling the cold Grimwood wind passing between his fingers as if it wanted to remind him he was made of flesh. The silence that followed lasted long enough for him to hear his own heartbeat. At the front of all of them, Toro Cruel. He had heard descriptions of the chief, heard the stories, but none of them had quite captured the scale. It wasn't only the size, though the size was considerable, shoulders that appeared to have been built to carry architecture, a height that placed his head at the level where most other orcs had their necks. It was the presence, the deliberate containment of something that could be far worse than it was being in that moment. Silver braids falling over a chest covered in scars that were not decoration. They were record, each one a story, each one a survivor. Yellow wild eyes burning with contained fury, the way embers burn with contained heat. Silently, completely, awaiting fuel. He stopped 3 meters from Thaddeus and stood still, assessing. The voice that came from him was not a shout. It was worse. It was calm. The kind of calm that is not the absence of violence but the control of it, which is far more dangerous because it depends on a continuously renewed decision. Human, we know you have what is ours. Return the child, and perhaps you'll see the dawn. Thaddeus kept his hands raised. He spoke slowly, each word placed with care, like bricks on a wall still being built. She is here. She is well. I didn't detain her. She came to me on her own. She's inside the cabin. You can go in and see her right now if you want. Toro Cruel didn't move. "You held her for ransom," he said. "Gold or passage through the northern trails. We know the customs of settlers." "There is no ransom," said Thaddeus. "There is no condition of any kind." He lowered one hand slowly, telegraphing every movement, and pulled from his coat pocket a piece of fabric. "I found this caught on my fence this morning." He held out the fragment of torn tribal garment without stepping forward, waiting for Torocrul to come take it. "She came to me. She was starving. I gave her food and let her sleep. That is all." One of the warriors in the formation moved to take the fabric and carried it to Torocrul. The chief examined it for a moment, fingers passing over the torn threads with an attention that was clearly that of a father recognizing the fabric of his child's clothing. Something in the rigidity of his shoulders yielded a single millimeter. Just one. "I can show her to you," said Thaddeus. "In the cabin. She's sleeping, or was. With the noise of the drums she's probably woken. But you can go in and see for yourself." 1 second passed, another. Torocrul made a single minimal gesture, and the bows lowered 1 degree. Not fully, but 1 degree. Enough to shift the tone of the silence from imminent execution to trial in progress. It was a small distinction, but a significant one. The same way the difference between a tight rope and a slack rope was small, but determined whether there was a hanging. "Take me to her," said the chief. And Thaddeus, with 200 pairs of yellow eyes following his every step, turned his back on the most dangerous man in Grimwood and walked toward his own cabin door. The girl was standing in the center of the cabin when they entered, her amber eyes wide between fear and relief in an equation that resolved itself the moment she saw her father. She took a step toward him, then stopped, as if there were a protocol that needed to be observed before she could be a child again. Torocrul knelt before her with a swiftness that didn't suit the size, his heavy hands landing on her shoulders with a lightness that was clearly practiced. He examined her from feet to head, the father's eyes running the inventory scan that fathers run, checking integrity, looking for damage. She said something in the clan's guttural tongue, fast and urgent, and gestured to the empty bowl still on the table, to the chair, to the cloak that had served as a blanket and was still folded on the seat. Torocrul listened with an attention that was not only loving, it was also strategic. The chief overlaid on the father in real time, processing each piece of information on 2 simultaneous layers. When she finished, he held her by the shoulders for a moment, looking into her eyes with an expression Thaddeus couldn't fully translate, but recognized in its structure. It was the look of someone checking whether the inside of a person was intact after the outside had survived. Then Torocrul stood, and his gaze swept the cabin. It was a warrior's gaze, reading an environment, fast, systematic registering, the tools on the wall organized by type and size, the fire well tended, the shelf with bread, dried vegetables, herbs in clay pots labeled with characters the chief probably couldn't read, but whose order suggested care, the bench worn from the constant use of a single person, the bed at the back, simple, with the pillow in the center, the pillow of a person alone, and then the table. Torocrul's gaze settled on the painted parchment miniature and stayed there. Thaddeus didn't try to explain. He let the silence work. The painting was not the work of an artist. It was the work of love, which is a different thing and often more honest. Maren smiling with her mouth slightly open, as she smiled when she was genuinely happy, not the courtesy smile she wore in public. Edric in her lap, 3 years old, and the dark curls he had inherited from his father, looking at something outside the frame with the expression of complete concentration that small children have when they discover something interesting on the ground. Around the miniature, the flowers, dried bluebells, picked and replaced every week without fail, because Maren had once said in passing that bluebells were her favorite flowers, and Thaddeus had registered that with the care he gave to important things. This week's flowers were new, placed 2 days ago, not yet completely dry. The chief stood silent before the miniature for a long moment. The muscles of his jaw moved. The yellow wild eyes read the image with an attention that was not that of a warrior analyzing intelligence. It was that of a father recognizing another species of pain. "You also lost a child," said Torokrul. And for the first time, the voice didn't carry the calculated calm of containment. It carried something closer to the surface, less managed, more true. It wasn't a question, it was a recognition. The difference mattered. Thaddeus didn't answer immediately. There was a kind of loneliness that needs no answer. It needs only a witness. And Torokrul was being a witness in that moment, with the involuntary precision of someone who might have lost his daughter 3 days ago to the swamp or the cold, and had arrived in time by a margin that both of them were only beginning to calculate. 3 years ago, said Thaddeus at last. Black fever, both of them. Torokrul looked at him, looked back at the miniature, at the flowers. Every week, he said, not as a question, but as a realization, seeing the flowers a second time with eyes that now had context. Every week, Thaddeus confirmed. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the yard. That one had been taught with the possibility of violence. This one was taught with something else, with the recognition that two very different people were standing in the same place, at the same distance from a loss that had no shape, but that organized everything around it, the way a whole organizes the space where the earth was missing. Outside, the drums waited. The trouble with moments of silent understanding is that they exist inside a world that hasn't stopped moving while they happened. Thaddeus and Torokrul stepped out of the cabin side by side to find the 200 warriors exactly where they had left them. In formation, patient with the trained patience of those who had learned that war is 90% waiting and 10% everything else. But there was something different in the tension of the semicircle now. A murmur running from warrior to warrior, like water current finding its path between stones. Kraz, Broken Lance, had stepped forward. Thaddeus identified him by the description he had heard years before in a traveller's account at a Grimwood tavern. The veteran with the horizontal scar cutting across the lower tusks. The left arm shorter than the right by 2 fingers, where a battle had taken its toll. The posture of someone who had survived enough to believe that survival was a personal competence and not a matter of circumstance. He stood at the front of the formation, between Torokrul and the rest of the warriors, in the specific position of someone who is not there by accident. He spoke in the clan's guttural tongue, loud enough to be heard by all, with the rhythm of someone delivering a speech that had been prepared and has a calculated audience. Thaddeus didn't understand the words, but understood the structure. The appeal to tradition, the repeated gesture in his direction as reference to a principle, the pause for effect after each point. It was the speech of someone invoking ancient law. Torokrul responded briefly, but Kraz didn't back down. He responded in turn, and this time, Thaddeus felt it before he saw it, half the warriors to the right of the semicircle began to move, not in attack, but in alignment, with Kraz. The movement was slow and deliberate, the kind of movement that means I stand with him without needing to be said aloud. Thaddeus understood enough. There was a law, there was a demand, and there were enough warriors to make the demand difficult to ignore even for Torokrul himself. It was then that the girl came out of the cabin. No one had called her, no one had expected her. She simply came out, barefoot on the hard-packed dirt of the yard, the cloak still on her shoulders, and walked to the center of the space between the 2 adult orcs, with the directness of someone who knows exactly where she needs to be and has no doubt about it. She positioned herself between them and spoke. She didn't plead. She This was the thing Thaddeus noticed first and kept noticing. There was no supplication in her voice, no rising modulation of someone asking for clemency. It was the voice of someone delivering a report, precise, sequential, with the kind of authority that comes not from position, but from direct experience of something the other people around her had not lived through. Thaddeus didn't understand the words, but could see their effect. He watched how the eyes of the warriors in the formation followed the girl without wavering. He watched how Toro Cruel stayed still with a stillness different from before. Not the calculated containment of the chief, but the involuntary paralysis of a father, hearing something that is changing the way he understands what almost happened. He watched how Kraz, Broken Lance, grew progressively quieter. She told them about the storm, the days without food, the cold mud of the swamp, the sight of the farm fences through the trees, like a line between being alive and not. The man who had set down his tools and walked with open hands. And then she turned to Kraz directly. She asked him a question, direct, clear, unadorned. Thaddeus didn't need to understand the words to understand the question. It was written in the angle of her body, in the direction of her gaze, in the silence she opened and waited for him to fill. What would you expect a stranger to do if your child were dying of hunger in the forest? Kraz, Broken Lance, veteran of 14 campaigns, and survivor of things most warriors didn't survive, stood looking at an 8-year-old girl for a moment that lasted longer than any speech he had prepared. He lowered his weapon. He said nothing. He stepped back one step, just one. But it was the step that mattered. The step out of the position of challenge, the step that dissolved the geometry of confrontation. The warriors to the right of the semicircle, who had moved in alignment with him, stood still for a moment, and then, one by one, returned to their place. The silence that followed had a different texture from all the previous silences of the night. Toro Cruel looked at his daughter for a long moment, then looked at Thaddeus. In the chief's expression, there was something Thaddeus recognized without being able to fully name. It was the expression of someone recalculating not just the facts of a situation, but something broader, the geometry of how things are arranged in the world. "You will come with us," said Toro Cruel, not as an order, or not only as an order, also as an invitation, and the distinction was in something subtle in the voice that Thaddeus wouldn't have been able to identify an hour earlier, but now could. "The council needs to see the man my daughter chose to defend." Thaddeus looked at the girl. She looked back at him with amber eyes, now completely clear of hunger and exhaustion, lit with something that was determination or perhaps confidence. In her version, the two were probably the same thing. He took his coat, checked the fire, and closed the cabin door. He followed Toro Cruel into Grimwood. Grimwood Forest at midnight was a different place from Grimwood Forest at noon. The same way people are different when they believe they aren't being watched. The same oaks that by day were only trees became at midnight a deliberate architecture, each branch an angle, each shadow a texture. The warriors moved through it with the familiarity of people moving through their own home, without looking at their feet, without hesitating at forks in the path, with a relaxation in their shoulders, indicating that the environment was ally and not adversary. Thaddeus walked in the center of the formation, not as prisoner. There were no chains, no hands holding him, but as someone under the custody of an agreement not yet written. The girl walked beside him for most of the journey, sometimes taking his arm when the terrain became more uneven, a gesture that began as practical guidance and continued as company. Probably the first human to enter this place alive. The phrase had passed through Thaddeus's mind while still in the yard and returned now with more force. He tried to process the weight of it and gave up. It was the kind of thing that would be processed later, if there was a later. The canyons revealed themselves gradually, as well-kept secrets tend to reveal themselves, not all at once. but in layers, each one disclosing just enough to alter what you thought you knew. First, the smell of smoke from multiple fires carried on a breeze that hadn't been felt outside the forest. Then the sound, low voices, the creak of leather being worked, the groan of wood under weight, the unmistakable sounds of a place where many people lived. Then the light, soft and fragmented between the canyon walls, the reflection of dozens of fires on stone that held heat and returned it in orange and ochre. And then the encampment, whole. It was larger than Thaddeus had imagined from any description he had ever heard. It wasn't an encampment, it was a city, small but complete, adapted to the topography of the canyons, with an architectural intelligence that used the rock walls as natural barriers, and built the rest with wood and leather and stone, with a precision that was not improvisation, but tradition. Fires in formation that ensured distributed heat, paths that curved around the rock at angles, maximizing passage and minimizing dead space. Small children awake at this hour, looking at Thaddeus with the unencumbered curiosity of those who hadn't yet learned to substitute curiosity with caution. Elder women standing at the entrances of dwellings with expressions he couldn't read. Warriors who had remained in the encampment, the remaining guard, turning bodies in his direction with the trained attention of sentinels assessing a new variable. The Council of 7 Elders was already assembled when they arrived, seated around the central fire in a semicircle mirroring the warriors' formation in the yard, except here there were chairs carved from dark wood, each one clearly specific to a specific person, the orc equivalent of deliberation thrones. The 7 were old in different ways, old with the oldness of accumulated wisdom, old with the oldness of improbable survival, old with the oldness of those who have seen enough to no longer be surprised by anything but who still show up. Green skin faded by decades of sun and winter, hair in various shades of white and grey, yellow eyes that observed Thaddeus with varied and convergent attentions. He was placed in the center of the semicircle. There was no chair for him. Standing, alone, with 7 pairs of eyes and the encampment assembly around him, the fire at his back cast his shadow forward, long and distorted. The judgment began. They deliberated in the clan's guttural tongue for hours, or what seemed like hours. Time inside the canyons ran on a different metric than what Thaddeus knew. Voices rose, responded, yielded, insisted, returned. There was structure to it, procedure, speaking order, moments of silence that clearly signified something. It wasn't chaos. It was law. A law he didn't understand, but whose seriousness was unmistakable. Toro Krul spoke at length. Kraz, at the back, spoke briefly. Others Thaddeus didn't know spoke with varying intensities. And then came the moment he had been waiting for. The girl was called to the center. She stood before the 7 elders with a posture that was at once the posture of a child, small, vulnerable in the scale of the space, and was not the posture of a child in any other way. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes without taking her eyes off the elders, without pausing except to breathe, without the body language of someone who is asking for something. It was the body language of someone describing what she had seen with the precision of a witness. Thaddeus watched her and thought she would probably be one day someone who changed things, not because she was exceptional in the sense of being different, but because there was in her basic structure a refusal to separate what she knew from what she said, which was the foundation of everything that mattered. The eldest of all, green skin faded by time to almost yellow, hair white as mountain snow, yellow eyes that had the quality of old mirrors reflecting with a matte softness, listened to everything in silence. When she finished, he asked her a single question. The entire encampment fell quiet. The girl answered without hesitation, yes, he would risk it again. The eldest stood still for a moment after her answer, not the stillness of one who hesitates, but the stillness of one placing the correct weight on something before carrying it. Then he rose. The movement was slow, with the care that very old bodies apply to actions that young bodies perform without thinking. But there was in it a deliberateness that made the slowness not weakness, but choice. The elder rising was an event, and every second of the movement was part of the event. The 6 other council members became completely quiet. The encampment around them did the same, silence spreading in waves from center to periphery like circles on water. When the elder spoke, he spoke in human, slowly, with the heavy accent of someone who had learned the language out of necessity rather than immersion, choosing each word with the attention of someone who knows that each one carries specific weight, but entirely intelligible, with a clarity that came not from fluency, but from deliberation. "The spirits test those who live on the edges," he said. "On the edges of the forest, on the edges of fear, on the edges of choice." He looked at Thaddeus with the yellow eyes that had that matte quality of an old mirror. "Tonight, the spirits sent a test to the edges of Grimwood, and a man chose." Pause. "The spirits did not send an enemy. The spirits sent a test, and mercy deserves mercy in return." The silence that followed was different from all the silences of the night. It was the silence of a decision being received, not contested, not applauded, received, which was the deepest form of acknowledgement. The elder continued. He decreed the safe passage. Thaddeus could enter and leave the territories of the Grey Tusk clan without impediment, his Grimwood lands recognized as neutral by any clan member. He decreed the protection. Any orc who caused harm to Thaddeus Mallister would answer to the council personally, and the council's law was the highest law the clan knew. What had taken generations to be offered to any human was being offered now because an 8-year-old girl had spoken for 10 minutes without taking her eyes off the elders. The only condition was set not as a demand but as a compliment. Thaddeus's promise to shelter any clan member who arrived wounded, starving, or lost on his lands. The formal extension of what he had already done once. Thaddeus didn't hesitate. There was nothing to hesitate about. "I swear," he said, and the word inhuman sounded different inside the canyons, more solid somehow, as if the surrounding stone were recording it. Toro Cruel, standing to the right of the council, made a movement with his head that Thaddeus interpreted, correctly he later knew, as the orc equivalent of "it is done." And then the girl came to him. She didn't run. She walked with the same directness she had employed when positioning herself between the 2 orcs in the yard. When she reached Thaddeus, she was small, the top of her head at his chest, but there was in her that quality that had been present from the beginning, the quality of someone whose physical size and actual presence were 2 different and separate metrics. She opened her arms and hugged him. Thaddeus stood still for a second, the second of someone who hasn't received a hug in 3 years and needs a moment to remember how to receive one, and then bent down, knelt, and hugged back. She smelled of smoke and wet earth and, faintly, of the food she had eaten in the cabin hours earlier, which was the most improbable and most devastating smell in the world in that moment. When she pulled back, she looked at him with those amber eyes that no longer carried any trace of hunger or fear, and said, in broken but completely deliberate human, choosing each syllable with the care the elder had used to choose the words of the decree, "You saved me. Now I save you." Thaddeus didn't respond immediately. There was a kind of symmetry in the phrase that took time to fully settle, like a brick that needs to be examined before being placed in the right position. "What is your name?" he asked. "Vraza," she said, and then, as if adding important context, "Vraza Stormtooth." "Thaddeus," he said, and then, because it seemed necessary and true, "Thaddeus Mallister." She repeated his name in a low voice, testing the sounds, and the corner of her mouth rose slightly in the expression closest to a smile he had seen from her, Thaddeus thought that there were times when smiles were the most common thing in the world, and times when they were the rarest, and that the difference between the two times was often much smaller than it seemed. Sometimes it was a storm, 3 days of hunger, a man who set down his tools. In the background, the eldest had returned to his seat. The other 6 were doing the same. The encampment began to resume its ordinary sounds, voices, movement, the crackling of fires, as if the decision had been made and the world had confirmed it could continue. Toro Cruel approached Thaddeus one last time that night, stopped before him, and for a moment simply looked at him. Then he extended his arm, not his hand, but his whole forearm, the warrior's greeting. Thaddeus extended his. The 2 forearms met, and Toro Cruel's grip closed around Thaddeus's arm with force enough to communicate respect and restraint enough to communicate choice. Thaddeus closed his hand around the chief's forearm with the same firmness. "Your word is law on my land," said Toro Cruel, "and mine is law on yours. Let Grimwood know this." "Grimwood will know," said Thaddeus. The honor escort formed before dawn. Thaddeus Mallister returned to his barn at dawn with 8 orc warriors behind him in a formation that was not custody, but ceremony. The difference was in everything, in the angle of spears carried at rest position, in the pace that matched his own, in the way they dispersed at the edge of the yard with a nod from Toro Cruel and departed back into the forest without fanfare. He stood in the yard for a moment, listening to Grimwood wake. Birds, wind in the oaks, the creek at the back of the property, indifferent to the night that had passed. Then he went inside, lit the fire and put water on to heat. He never got rich, he never got famous. In the years that followed, when the story of that night reached the ears of Grimwood settlers, and it did, the way stories travel that nobody tells officially but everyone knows, it arrived in various versions, some with more warriors than there had been, some with battles that never happened, some with heroic words Thaddeus had never spoken. He didn't correct them, not because it didn't matter, but because the true version had already been recorded in the places that mattered, in the council's decision, in Toro Cruel's forearm, in Vraza's amber eyes, in that moment at the center of the canyons. The barn became neutral territory, not overnight. Nothing that matters happens overnight. It happened gradually, the way all lasting things happen, by repetition, by consistency, by a series of small gestures accumulating until they became structure. An orc warrior arriving wounded after a confrontation on the trails and being treated without question. A human settler lost in hunting territory and being returned to the forest's edge with a map drawn on leather, then 2, then 5, then a meeting where both arrived at the same time for different reasons and left at the same time for equal ones. Lord Aldrich sent 2 furious letters. Thaddeus answered both in the same quiet tone, explaining that his lands were his and that what happened on them was his responsibility. Morrison, the feudal inspector, stopped visiting after the 3rd year. Reverend Thorne visited one last time, looked around the property with the expression of a man updating his theology in real time, and left without saying anything more than "May the spirits protect you," which was the highest blessing a man of his tradition could give. Vraza Stormtooth grew up. She grew the way people grow who had a defining experience early. Not faster than others, but in a different direction, like a tree that grew beside another and learned to lean toward where the light was available. She learned human fluently, then the Grimwood dialect, then the feudal merchant code. She learned the language of the northern clan and the southern clan. She learned that most conflicts between orcs and humans in Grimwood were conflicts of translation, not of intention, but of word, of gesture, of custom misread. She became a translator, then a mediator, then the person both sides called when words failed before axes needed to be drawn. Thaddeus watched this happen up close because Vraza visited. Not regularly at first. A mediator's life was not a life of routines, but consistently, with the consistency of someone who considers a promise a promise. She arrived with news from the forest, with stories he couldn't have heard from any other source, with occasional gifts of herbs he didn't grow, and whose uses she explained with the patience of someone who likes to teach. He taught her the cabin recipes, fixed things she brought broken, listened, and every year, on the date of that night, the day the drums had sounded and Thaddeus had opened the door instead of bolting it, she arrived at the barn with enough food for two and stayed as long as it took to share a meal, and sometimes more than a meal, seated at the same table where the empty bowl had been the most convincing argument a lonely man had managed to make to the most feared warrior in Grimwood. Thaddeus lived to 73 years. He died on an October morning, on the bench by the fire, with the smell of freshly baked bread in the air and fresh bluebells on the table. Vraza had replaced them the evening before. He died as he had lived his final years, surrounded, which was the most improbable thing anyone building alone in Grimwood could have hoped for. There were humans in the yard, the blacksmith from Aldrich below, who had learned to repair orc tools thanks to Thaddeus's introduction. Two sons of the farmer Cletus, who had grown without their father's prejudice because they had seen with their own eyes what happened when prejudice was suspended for one night. A young woman from Grimwood who had come to Thaddeus when the settlers wanted to burn her as a witch because she had defended an orc family, and who had found in the barn a place where that was not madness, but precedent. There were orcs in the yard, warriors Toracrul had sent as morning honor, silent and precise as the honor escort they had been at dawn 39 years before. The girl who had become Vraza Stormtooth, translator of 3 dialects, mediator of 6 treaties, a woman with amber eyes that still carried that quality of clarity that had been there from the beginning. She stood beside the bench for a time she didn't measure, looking at Thaddeus's face with the inventory expression she had learned from her own father, checking integrity, looking for damage, finding peace. Then she stepped out to the yard, looked at the 2 gathered groups, and spoke in both languages alternately, the simultaneous translation of the end of a life that had been lived in both. He had none of our blood. He had none of our law. He had no reason at all except the reason that every person carries inside themselves and that most never use. And yet he chose. And yet he built. And yet he stayed. The barn continued after that. It continued as neutral territory, as it had been. Thaddeus Mallister's name entered slowly into the kind of story that Grimwood's children hear before sleep. Not the version with battles and heroes and words that were never spoken, but sometimes in the families that knew the true version. The man who set down his tools, the man who walked with open hands, the man who placed a bowl of stew on the table and didn't look away. Vraza replaced the bluebells every week for 10 years after he died. Then she taught her children to replace them, then her children's children. A promise was the only currency that still held value. Blood makes you orc. Pain makes you human. But setting down your tools and walking with open hands is what makes 2 strangers a family.